Hey guys, it's Graham. What's cracking? I am once again driving to work at midnight, and of course I left 5 minutes later than I wanted to, and that means I am stuck at a crossroads behind a train. Hopefully it won't last too long. Alright, let's talk about cars as I drive to work in my Dodge Durango, because I picked Dodge as my favorite vehicle brand in the year 2000 when I was 15, and stubbornly refused to ever change or look back. And in the same way that guys become fiercely loyal to sports teams or their wives, I decided that I was a Mopar guy, and that was that. It was just never going to change. Around that same time, I decided that, maybe not that I wanted to grow up to be a mechanic, but that I was always going to be mechanically inclined and interested. At the time, my dad was doing a resto mod, not really a mod, more of not a frame off restoration either. Like, he was semi-restoring but updating in certain ways a 67 DeVille convertible. He was a Cadillac guy. He'd had that car in his teens, and that was kind of my crash course introduction into mechanics, learning how to turn wrenches under a hood and how the whole bit worked. But like I said, I was going to be a Mopar guy. And so it wasn't until just recently that I looked into the history of the Dodge company and the Chrysler company. Dodge, how it got started in the early 1900s, and Chrysler, who later bought them out in the 1920s after the founders died. I've got these two books here, The Dodge Brothers and Riding the Roller Coaster, both written by Dr. Charles K. Hyde, who, if I remember right from his bio, he's originally from Wisconsin, but now he lives in Michigan, outside of Detroit. And so, him being a college professor and an historian and, living in the Motor City, those two things overlapped, and he's become a history of the automotive industry in North America. Brief summary of the Dodge brothers. They grew up in a family of machinists. Their dad was a machinist, their uncles were. And so, with that being the family trade, they kind of fell into it, and then they started their own shops up there in Michigan. And right around this time, the Ford Motor Company was taking off. They were big partners with Ford in the beginning, but before Ford, they had a partnership with Oldsmobile. And that was what kind of gave them their start. It was the Ford contract that really made them take off and get big. And the two brothers, John and Horace, John was the elder and, kind of the more responsible of the two, but they were both kind of joined at the hip throughout their business. They even, famously insisted on having correspondence addressed to them as the Dodge brothers. They were working class who worked their way up, lived the American dream. And this was at a time when Detroit was becoming the American Paris. It was definitely not what we know it today to be 100 years later, crime-ridden, broke, all that stuff. They were sticklers for detail, they were sticklers for quality, and they made vehicles that, while they cost a little bit more to get into than, their Ford or GM competitors, they lasted a lot longer. Their trucks were shipped off to Europe for World War I. Blackjack Pershing was a huge fan. He and a little up-and-comer named George Patton were both huge fans of them and insisted on Dodge vehicles being their weapon of choice. So that was cool. These Dodge brothers knew what they were doing, knew what they were about. When they broke off from the Ford company, the reasoning was that they knew they were too dependent on Ford, and a change from Ford could mean kind of ruin for them, and they were somewhat leveraged with factories and real estate that they had bought for the purpose of servicing the Ford contract, and without that contract they had nothing. So that drove them to want to start their own company. It was daunting. They knew that they were going to have to learn like 5 new elements of business other than just the actual manufacturing portion, which they'd grown up in, they knew how to do. They were going to have to learn management, sales, customer service, all that. They got a taste of it working for Ford, but being completely responsible for it was going to be very different. Nevertheless, they did well, and they continued to open dealerships and generate hype as they went into their early model years. Sadly, both the brothers died in 1920, of complications related to influenza, one at the beginning of the year, one at the end of the year. But the company still had strong brand recognition and people were satisfied with it, so it was taken into receivership and owned by somebody else who didn't really know how to do it as well as the Dodge brothers did. And a couple years later, he sold it off to Walter P. Chrysler, and this is where, not really where the Chrysler book begins, but that's the end of the overlap between Hyde's Chrysler book and his Dodge book. The thing I found interesting about Walter P. Chrysler is that, while he didn't grow up with the machining background of the Dodge brothers, he still threw himself into the automotive sciences in a way that made him successful early on. He had $700 to his name, found a car that he wanted to buy. It cost $5,000, so he borrowed the other $4,300, bought the car, pulled it into a barn, took it apart and put it back together a couple of times until he knew the thing backwards and front, and that was his education in cars. Now, reading both of these men's origin stories, the Dodge brothers who inherited machining as a trade, and Walter Chrysler who fought his way into it the hard way, it makes me think on my own false start into mechanics as a trade. I had a very narrow window of opportunity to get into it, to go to school for it in 2005. I took some bad advice from people that I cared about who talked me into going into the traditional college route. And then by the time I dropped out of that, I wasn't really in a position to take the financial and temporal hit and go back into school to be a mechanic. So, I knocked around other jobs until I became a truck driver, and I've been doing that ever since. But one of the reasons my wife and I bought the house that we have now with the shop in the backyard was I've never given up on that dream of becoming a self-educated mechanic, buying a project, moving it into the shop, getting a manual, and just working on it. When I was 18, my brother bought a 59 Rambler Special 6, and I ended up driving that car for a while because he went on his mission. It was a freakishly simple vehicle. My dad even found an original manual for it, threw it to me and said, hey, fix the clutch, fix whatever, and that was part of my early education as a backyard mechanic, as a garage mechanic. And for the most part, I was successful for it. The only issue with that Rambler was it was a defunct brand, and so it was extremely hard and expensive to find parts for it when you couldn't just slap something together in your backyard. So I've kept the dream alive of doing that, and cars today are a lot more complicated than they were 100 years ago, but you still have things like the Haynes manuals, the Chilton manuals. There's a way to do it if you're driven enough and determined enough. And just the other day, I was talking to my wife about this Instagram account that I follow called Vanguard Motors, that they find American classics and just spruce them up to the nines and sell them for six figures, which, 20 years ago, an original Challenger was going for 80 or 90 grand. Like now it's way more than that. These guys aren't doing them original. They're updating the tech. You'd want better suspension on a Mopar than torsion bars. You'd want better than just drum brakes all around, especially if you've got a Hemi or a 440 under the hood. But, I was telling her, it's like, man, I would have to build a car like that. I wouldn't really be able to afford one. So I'd have to go down to Dallas and find, just the frame and the body and worry about getting my own drivetrain later. And she's like, well, if you wanted to do that and get a decent turnaround time and, you flip one of them a year, that'd be pretty good. And I was like, well, shoot, let's say I'm done with this particular flavor of trucking by the time I'm 50, and I've been working on cars in my backyard at that point. I've got a method down, and then I could spruce up some old muscle cars, breathe new life into them, flip them one at a time, move a car every year or two. Shoot, that'd be the way to do it. It's reading accounts of the Dodge brothers and Walter Chrysler that kind of drives me to believe that I can. Right now I gotta budget the $30 to get the Haynes manual for my Durango just so that I can fix that myself. Those are famously built on a complete teardown and rebuild, doing it the Chrysler way. I think they cover everything but the dash stuff, which is fine. I need to replace the CD player in this thing anyhow. It's shot. I play everything through the aux cord. But anyway, managed to cross this damn train track twice, and here I am getting hit by the same train again. This is what I found of interest in these books, that don't just serve as a history of these two car companies that became one, but an inspiration due to their origins. The way that, you know, these men grew up in a world that didn't have the thing that they ultimately became famous for. They made it. And I'm not looking to reinvent the wheel or reinvent the car industry. Heaven knows I wouldn't want to deal with all of the red tape and the three-letter agencies that oversee all that. But yeah, you know, if I could keep some classics alive on the road in somebody's collection, then I'm all about that life. I highly recommend you guys check out these books for the historical value and the insight into the early days of the American automotive industry. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you're new. Like this video. Go ahead and share it out. I'm Graham Bradley. I write books. I read books. I draw pictures for books. I sell daydreams and daydream accessories. Hope you'll stick around. Drive safe. See you out there.